It is at least a bit shocking to some people to see International Women's Day marches going side by side with Bolshevik symbols and slogans. But as shocking as it may be, it's completely unsurprising since International Women's Day is nothing more than a Bolshevik business from one end to the other. International Women's Day, in its institutional incarnation and in its activism, both past and present, has nothing whatsoever to do with women and never had. But it has everything to do with Marxism, particularly Marxism-Leninism. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. In the last 25 years, since socialism fell out of fashion with the collapse of the USSR, feminists, with trivial exceptions, at least tried to pretend that March 8 is not a fundamentally Bolshevik celebration, and also tried to tone down as much as possible from the overt Marxist-Leninist rhetoric. But not anymore. This year, on March 8, the feminists in Bucharest, Gothenburg, Belgrade, Paris, and other European cities marched in a triumphalist communist hysteria using overt communist symbols, and in the case of Bucharest, or outright marching alongside far-left extremist organizations, such as the Communist Collective of Paris, the Communist Party of Gothenburg, Young Communists of Paris, or the Revolutionary Communist Youth of Sweden. The feminists in Bucharest made sure that nobody misinterprets their hysterical communist performance and issued a communique in which they glorified the Russian Revolution and the rise of the USSR, and incidentally omitting the millions of women executed or starved to death in the gulags following that revolution. But while it is hardly a surprise that feminism and left-wing politics are in bed with each other, it is not particularly known to the general public, particularly in Western Europe, that the whole March 8 thingy is, in its entirety, the result of German-influenced Bolshevik thought. Nothing more, nothing less. To understand this, we need to go a little over 100 years back in history to 1910 to two German ladies, Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Eisner, the latter being known better by the name Clara Zetkin. To understand how important Clara Zetkin was, look at it this way. Her obituary in the Manchester Guardian newspaper, which is the modern-day The Guardian, she is referred to as the grandmother of German communism. And a commie grandmother indeed she was. For instance, Clara Zetkin and her longtime friend Rosa helped founding the Socialist International in itself, and Zetkin herself contributed quite a lot to the development of Bolshevik thought. So appreciated was Zetkin in the USSR that she lived her last days there and is buried right next to the Kremlin wall in the same spot where other key figures of the Soviet Union are also buried, such as Stalin, Yuri Andropov, Mikhail Suslov, or Leonid Brezhnev. Mrs. Zetkin was also amongst the privileged recipients of high Soviet distinctions such as the Order of Lenin and the Order of the Red Banner, the latter being rarely awarded to non-military personnel unless we're talking about very, very special people to the advancement of Bolshevik thought and ideology. That's how special Mrs. Zetkin was. So, at the Congress of the Second Socialist International in August 1910 in Copenhagen, Mrs. Zetkin, supported by Rosa Luxemburg, proposes the creation of an International Women's Day, but without establishing an exact date. Her proposal is accepted and is implemented for the first time on March 19 the next year, when Marxist feminists protests erupt in Austria, Denmark, and Germany. The actual day itself remains quite variable from March the 3rd till March the 15th in the following years until 1921, when the USSR officially adopts March 8 as the International Women's Day. But why March 8? Well, March 8 was selected in order to commemorate the events that led to the Russian Revolution of 1917, which started with the workers' strike at a weapons factory in Petrograd, which is the modern-day St. Petersburg, which eventually degenerated into full-blown chaos, which resulted in the Second Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and you know the rest of that. Again, the day had nothing to do with women in particular. The feminist history insists that the whole debacle commenced with the female workers' strike at a textile factory in Petrograd, but that's simply not true. The textile factory did not went into strike until March 9, whereas the Putilov weapons plant in Petrograd had already entered full strike since March 3, 1917. And the weapons plant strike actually did matter, since Russia was engaged in World War I, and surely that mattered more than some minuscule textile plant stopping work for a few hours. Now, it should be noted that the Marxist feminists in general are not directly responsible for the events of 1917, but their rhetoric came out as the winner from all the chaos, and one of the lasting results of that is March 8 as the International Women's Day. Now you're probably asking, how did that happen? Well, this is where it becomes interesting. The International Women's Day did not actually become that international until over 20 years since the Soviet Union adopted it, and every country that adopted it essentially did so as a result of direct or indirect Soviet subversion. In countries occupied or aligned with the Soviet Union, it was simply adopted because the Kremlin said so. This was the case in Eastern Europe, Cuba, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, North Korea, and so on. This is the uninteresting part of the story. The interesting part of the story is how the former Western Bloc adopted the inextricably Bolshevik holiday. While the Western Bloc did somewhat tolerate the existence of communist and socialist parties and movements, their appeal towards instituting a Women's Day did not actually catch with the public because, you see, the public was not formed by idiots, and despite the Soviet claims to the contrary, most of the Western public was sane and unpersuaded by Bolshevik propaganda. So the Soviets had to do what they did best: create a seemingly innocuous mythology to advance long-term Soviet narratives. And that's how the myth of the supposedly 1857 New York female workers' struggle was born. According to the Soviet paid mythology, Women's Day now commemorated the March 8th of 1857, when seamstresses conducted a protest march through New York, but the only problem is that that march never took place. Sometimes this myth is perpetuated by the cathedral media even today, even though it has been debunked conclusively and decisively over 40 years ago by the French historian Françoise Pic. Now, if you look through the English language sources, you will often find the claim that this mythology was created in 1955 because the female leader of the largest French trade union at the time, Madame Madeleine Colin, wanted to gain independence from the dominant Union of French Women and the Communist Party. It is alleged that she believed that the communist celebration of Women's Day had become too traditional and reactionary, and that by bringing U.S. workers into the picture, she could present the day in a new light, that of the struggle of female workers. Now, whatever the beliefs of Madeleine Colin, this line of reasoning simply does not stand to basic scrutiny, for the simple reason that the mythology of the supposed 1857 New York protests was manufactured and printed by the newspaper L'Humanité, which was entirely funded by the Communist Party of France, which in turn was directly funded by Moscow. Now, one of the people who would have to approve anything printed in L'Humanité was a man named Maurice Torres, the leader of the French Communist Party until his death in 1964. Mr. Torres had exempted himself from the duty of defending France in the Second World War by fleeing to, yes, the USSR. So the story that Colin fabricated history because she was unhappy with the Soviet-inspired Women's Day is just that, a story. She could not have done that if Maurice Torres did not approve this revisionist mythology and if Torres himself had not asked his financial backers in Kremlin. That's how things worked and continued to work well into the late 80s when the François Mitterrand administration was caught really naked, as his cabinet not only had Soviet sympathizers but actual KGB agents. So to tell me that in 1955 the Soviet-funded Communist Party of France just allowed the random feminists to act independently on their platform, well, you might as well try to sell me a bridge, if you know what I mean. Now, this propaganda move turned out to be really successful. Once the mythology of the New York protests became common knowledge in France, it also became common knowledge amongst feminists such as Simone de Beauvoir, a great admirer of the Soviet Union, who took the torch of this mythology and took it straight to the American and British feminists. Now, while I wrote an expose of Simone de Beauvoir, link in the low bar, I don't know whether de Beauvoir was aware of this particular episode of Soviet subversion, but I contend that it doesn't matter. Even if she had been aware, it was still to her ideological interest to play along. Now, regardless of this aspect, once the mythology became common knowledge amongst Marxist feminists in the United States and Britain, it was only a matter of time until the cultural influence of these countries would spread the fundamentally Bolshevik celebration to the non-communist world. And this is exactly what happened. To make things worse, the ascension in the academia of the communists involved in the radical collectives of the 60s and 70s also served as a good tool to preserve and enhance the communist legacy of March 8. And that's how we've gone full circle. That's how we get back to the modern-day Göteborg, Bucharest, Paris, and various other European cities which witnessed communist hysteria in their streets on March 8. Virtually 100% of the people participating in these marches have been educated by academicians who were Bolshevik themselves in their youth, or by academicians who are significantly inspired by, essentially, Bolshevik thought. So yeah, the Soviet Union died, but its ideological cancer survives in many ways, and one of these ways is mainstream feminism. So the next time you encounter March 8 bollocks, remember to call its promoters by their proper name: Soviet Bolshevik agitators. Because that's exactly what they are. And with that being said, thank you for watching and especially for supporting this channel. I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.